So we're going to start looking at priorities for an ELF context. As with any class, with any area of language, we would suggest that the best place to start is with a thorough needs analysis. And by this we mean two main things. One being discussion with the students. So just simply knowing your students is always a good rule of thumb, knowing why they're learning English, and particularly who they are communicating in English with. As one of the key principles of English as a lingua franca is that it's more important to consider who is speaking to whom than where they are. The other part of the needs analysis then is diagnostic work. So listening to your students' pronunciation and identifying any potential gap between their current intelligibility in an ELF context or their likely intelligibility and the intelligibility which they need. And we're going to talk in a moment about how you judge that. If you've spoken to your students and you've determined that ELF is a more realistic way of looking at their use of language than English as a foreign language, for example, then in the multilingual classroom, you have a ready-made ELF environment. Your students are already using English together as their lingua franca, and we've found that one successful way of identifying how intelligible they are in that context is through a basic dictation exercise, but one in which they dictate sentences to each other. And one way that it's very simple to set this up is by using sentences which are already in your course book, if you're using a course book, typing them out a little bit bigger and spacing them out so that you can cut them up and give one to each student. And then each student is responsible for reading their sentence to the others who need to take that sentence as a dictation. As an example, these are some sentences I've used from a course book recently. You can see they're standard type of sentences you see at the beginning of a unit, designed to start discussion on the topic. I used them not initially for vocabulary or discussion work, but as diagnostic sentences from my student-student dictation. And the idea is that the students have time to prepare their sentences, but that I don't set any kind of context beforehand, because when they're taking the dictation, I want them to rely entirely on sound, not on top-down guessing of meaning from context. So I can get as close as possible to simply what they hear and what sounds they produce. While they're doing that, I take notes, and they look a little bit crazy like this. When I first did this, I didn't anticipate showing it to a room of people and potentially people online. So these notes are from me, and I'm just scribbling down things which I notice as they speak about anything to do with pronunciation, whether I think it's relevant to ELF or otherwise, but anything that stands out to me, which I think will help me inform my analysis later. And the thing I've circled in blue here is an example of something which I anticipated being a problem and was a problem, I realized later. And two things in red to show you that there are also things that turned out to be problematic later, which I hadn't anticipated. So this is a wonderful exercise as a learning tool for me as well, because it makes me challenge my intuitions about what my students need or don't need in order to be intelligible, particularly in an ELF context, because English is my first language. And that means that I have a little bit of work to do to appreciate how it is to be a second language English user listening to another second language English user. And you can see that I've circled here things which I discovered later were a problem. The one circled in red here, originally the word was remind. Several students heard it as remain. And the beauty of this is that when I collect their papers in afterwards, I can see how several students had the same difficulty, so I can work out what they have in common. So once you've got all this data about what your students have produced and what they've perceived within their ELF context, within that multilingual classroom, you need to kind of apply an ELF filter. Again, assuming that you have determined that their goal is to be intelligible in a lingua franca context. And fortunately, such a filter exists. Some research was done some 13 years ago that Katie mentioned by a woman called Jennifer Jenkins, who some of you have probably heard of. And she devised a list of features which were shown in her data to be absolutely crucial for intelligibility in a lingua franca context. The list is quite long and a little bit, it takes some time to get your head around the details and how it would work. So just to summarize, there are 5 key areas. Most consonant sounds were included in the core, and again, it's called core as these are essential for intelligibility. There's room outside the core for other features of pronunciation, which might give the speaker an accent, as we may commonly term it, but it wouldn't break down communication. So most consonant sounds are in that core. Consonant clusters are also very important to be preserved. So words like street, the s-t-r at the beginning, it's quite important in ELF to make sure that that is maintained. One vowel sound, and it's the vowel in words like bird and word, it's the sound. The other vowel sounds, their quality was not considered crucial to intelligibility. Vowel length, particularly before unvoiced consonants. So the concept that the vowel in a word like hat is very slightly shorter than the vowel in a word like had. And nuclear stress, which is to do with where the stress falls in a thought group or a word group. So in a sentence like, let's visit your mother next Saturday, that would contrast in meaning with a sentence like, let's visit your mother next Saturday, because the stress is placed in a different location. And especially where used for contrast, that was seen as crucial for intelligibility in an ELF context. Applying this to your classroom, the techniques really don't need overhauling. The way that you normally teach pronunciation if you're aiming for English as a foreign language or aiming for your students to approximate a native-like accent, such as received pronunciation, as Richard spoke about, you can use the same techniques if you're aiming to improve intelligibility in ELF. Drilling, simple drilling of sounds and developing the automatic nature of pronunciation. Minimal pairs, particularly important in ELF for some contrasts like the vowel length distinction, hat, had, and so on, making sure the students can recognize them and produce them. Basic discrimination exercises, like I said, with a difference in meaning between let's visit your mother next Saturday and let's visit your mother next Saturday. So training your students to recognize those differences in sound and to produce them. And awareness of the articulators, really important for all pronunciation teaching. But particularly in ELF, one of the key principles is the concept which Richard touched on earlier, that accent is flexible and people modify their pronunciation and they do it in a number of different contexts for a number of different reasons. And in a lingua franca context, speakers of English might well be interacting with a vast, with a wide variety, of different pronunciations of English. And the ability to be aware of how sounds are produced and how to modify your speech is really, really valuable. Based on all of this data and applying your filter, you arrive at a syllabus, a list of things to prioritize for your classroom. If you teach in a multilingual classroom, this can be a little bit more difficult to do than if your students all share the same first language, and if you share that first language, as I don't know about you, but I don't speak all of the first languages of all of my students in a multilingual classroom, so finding what they have in common poses a challenge, and this is a challenge that I attempted to address when I did some research in this area and devised a piece of material that helps you see what the students have in common across 12 different first language backgrounds. That resource is available on our blog, and there's a link to that on your handout.